Hey listeners, Jenny here, and I have an invitation for you. Here is an opportunity to learn from a previously overwhelmed and burned out entrepreneur, me, now living a balanced and healthy life of freedom. So I can show you exactly what it takes for you as well to live a healthy life with an aligned and values-driven work and life balance. It is possible. If you're struggling to manage your ADHD, overwhelm, and business, I know you want to improve your focus, be capable of relaxing, feel energized, and have more quality time with the people you love, doing the things you love. But if you keep running your business and your life on stress and adrenaline, or from a place of not feeling good enough and needing to prove your worthiness, you're not only going to burn out, but potentially get chronically ill or lose your business or important relationships. I'm sure you don't want that, and neither do I. And there is another way. In this free workshop, From Overwhelmed to Empowered, 7 Steps to Unmask, Align and Succeed as an ADHD Entrepreneur, I'm going to show you a radically different approach to managing and embracing your ADHD in an ADHD-friendly way, so that you can take back control of your time, run a successful and values-run business and life without the stress and burnout. Imagine what your life could look like. All you need to do is save the date right now, 5th of March at 1 p.m. GMT. And for anyone joining from across the pond, that's 8 a.m. EST. Then head over to jennyadamscoach.co.uk/align and join the priority list. Excited to see you there. I'm talking to Jackie Baxter of the Long COVID podcast in this episode. And before you switch off, if you haven't had long COVID, this is also an episode for you. So Jackie not only shares her recovery from long COVID and why she started her podcast and how much she has learned from the community and the people she has met on her podcast, but we also talked about the importance of acceptance when we have any kind of chronic illness, neurodiversity, any kind of health condition, and how that is such an important step in getting better, managing things in a much healthier way. She also shares some fascinating information about the breath. So she works supporting people with breathwork and what the breath can do for us, how it helps our nervous system, and why the breath is one easy thing that we can all control. It influences our nervous system, and it's so important for everybody. She shares some really helpful tips. So I hope you find this as interesting a conversation as I did. Thank you for tuning in to the Calm Your Nervous System podcast, where you will learn to regulate your nervous system, not just calm it. I'm your host, Jenny Adams, and I'm a somatic coach who has recovered from debilitating ME and trauma. Alongside my guest experts, I'm here to share tips, stories, and debunk jargon, what is somatics anyway, about how you can regulate your nervous system so you don't have to live with chronic illness, burnout, or debilitating trauma for the rest of your life. A joyful life is possible. So, hi Jackie, and thank you so much for coming on the podcast. So, Jackie runs the Long COVID podcast, and remind me, how many episodes do you have of the Long COVID podcast out now? 100.
I think 160 is going out this week.
Okay.
But I've had a few weeks off over Christmas, so I can't remember the exact number. I think it's 160.
Wow, that's a lot. That's dedicated. Wow. So
Yeah.
what is it that made you start the podcast, and when did you start it?
So I think it was at the end of the summer 2021. So at that point, I'd been unwell for a bit over a year. And to start with, I'd been allowed to work from home. Now, in hindsight, I shouldn't have been. But at the time, I was working from home and, sort of sort of coping with that, but not coping with that. And then after the summer, I was expecting, for whatever reason, that I would be able to continue doing this. I'd be able to keep working from home. And then I was told, in what I thought was quite a harsh way, but that was the way I took it at the time, that this was no longer an option and that I needed to be back at work physically. And I worked in schools, several different schools in a city that was about a 2 hour commute away.
Wow.
So that's quite a lot for anybody, but certainly for someone with long COVID, it obviously wasn't an option. So I was kind of pushed into sick leave, which was, in hindsight, the best possible thing for me. But at the time, it felt like I lost the only thing that I had left in my life. I sort of felt like my job was about the only thing that I had. So I thought, what can I do? And for whatever reason, I thought a podcast. I thought, if I'm feeling this alone and this hopeless, and, like I'm kind of worthless, when something like this happens, you do feel worthless, don't you? Because you can't do any of the things that you're quote unquote supposed to be able to do. So I thought, well, maybe this is something that I can do because, it can sort of fit around my abilities and I could actually do it lying down and, all of this. So the podcast was born, and if I'd realized how much work it would be, I would never have done it. But it was a bit of a lifeline for me because it gave me purpose. It was too much at times, and there were weeks where I had to take weeks off, and there were a lot of struggles through it. But it was amazing because we talk about connection and how difficult it is to connect with people when you're unwell and when you sort of exist in this different world to the rest of the world. And it, to me, felt like my lifeline to other people, to these connections that I made with, people around the world, people who understood what I was going through on some level, people who had experience in it as medical experts. And I learned so much from the people that I spoke to. So, and actually the people that I now work with are people that I met through the podcast as well. So it's been a really,
Wow.
I don't know, maybe a silver lining of a horrible experience is something that I've kind of been able to, I don't know if it sounds too cheesy to say I built it from the ashes of my life kind of thing. But yeah, it was an experience, that's for sure. And, I'm not very good at singing my own praises, but I think actually looking back on it, it's something I'm immensely proud of.
Yeah, and good on you for being proud of yourself because, I mean,
I'm
I
trying.
think I heard us. Well, yeah. Are you trying or are you doing?
I'm trying.
I can see you doing rather than trying. But yeah, when we have podcasts, I think I heard a statistic that like such a small amount of people, like only half or quite a low percentage of people actually get past like episode 10 because it can be a lot of work and it can be thankless sometimes.
Yeah.
But there is this passion that I know that you and me share to support and help people, especially
Yeah.
those that like we've been in their shoes. And I'm sure for you at the time, I don't want to speak for you, but was there a sense of feeling like alone and where do I go with this? And especially if you said you started it kind of summer 2021, was long COVID even like a recognized thing at that point, or was it just COVID and some people just kind of weren't recovering?
Yeah, no, the timing is sketchy, but I called it the long COVID podcast because I mean, I have the most ridiculous imagination. My imagination is one of my strengths. So why I went for the long COVID podcast, I do not know because it is not very imaginative. But
It's very clear
long
and
COVID
concise
must have,
though.
well, exactly, it does what it says on the tin, doesn't it?
Exactly.
But it must have been recognized in some form because that was what I called it. I mean, the medical definition of it or the clinical definition of it has sort of changed over time. And to be honest, I'm not actually 100% sure what it is at the moment. But, I think at that point it was long COVID, but the links between ME/CFS and other conditions, I think, were not really being talked about. And, you said this sort of feeling of aloneness. And, I think you do feel very alone. You feel like it's just you, and with long COVID, I obviously don't have experience of CFS and ME, but I think the thing with long COVID was that there was that strength in numbers. It did kind of happen to everyone all at the same time, or, within a smaller period of time. It was everyone getting hit by this one virus or iterations of that one virus. So there was that kind of commonality of, once you did start to hear about other people, there was that sense of kind of, this is my tribe. These other people also know what's going on. Well, they don't know what's going on, but they're experiencing the same thing. So there was that kind of collective helplessness, which did help in some way because you felt less alone. You still felt alone because the world was continuing without you, but you felt less alone in that other people were sharing that experience. Whereas what I've heard from people who have had things like ME/CFS is that it has been much more isolating in that there haven't been thousands and millions of other people having that same experience at the same time. Now, again, whether that's good or bad, I don't know. But I think, a lot of it for me was I'm not afraid of trying things. I am sort of incredibly curious and I just want to know. If I know and I understand, then I know what to do. And I think the problem for me at the start was that I did feel helpless because I had no idea what was going on. And I'd gone from this person who was a fit, healthy, absolutely fine, putting that in very hefty quotation marks, which I'm sure we will get onto at some point. But, I was invincible. I was 30, nothing could happen to me at the time. And then literally overnight, I went from this completely fine person that ran up mountains and did, 3 different jobs at once to this person who couldn't get out of bed, literally couldn't get out of bed. I remember one time where I went to the bathroom and we lived in a very small flat. The bedroom was literally right next to the bathroom. And my heart rate was so high that I thought I was going to die.
Wow.
When I got back into bed, it took hours for it to come down to something kind of resembling normal. So it was this kind of I cannot understand how I can go from this to this. It just didn't make sense. You suddenly have a million things wrong with you. That doesn't, it was literally like a switch flipped kind of thing. And I think what the podcast did for me was that it started initially sharing experiences and sharing that you're not alone kind of thing. There are other people who are also having this. But very quickly, I started speaking to people who had worked some things out and had started seeing improvement. And suddenly it was like, oh my goodness, this can get better. And then I met someone who had recovered. I saw her post in a support group, I think. And she said, I've recovered from long COVID. And I thought, is that possible? And suddenly, you hear that someone's recovered and it changes your entire world, doesn't it? You go from this person where you think, is this my life from now on? And if it is, I'm genuinely not sure if I want to be here, to suddenly, this is possible. I can get out of this because this other person has. So that was that massive light bulb moment, and her story wasn't the same as mine. It had commonalities, of course it did. But, I wasn't going to follow her story, her rule book, her blueprint. But, some of the things she said were helpful. And it just gave me that kind of belief, I suppose, that it was possible. It didn't matter how long it took, that I would not stop trying until I did recover. And it also allowed me, I think, that moment of, I don't know, some people say surrender or acceptance or whatever you want to call it, where you say, okay, if I'm not going to get better, then I might as well keep pushing myself because what else is there to do? Whereas if I know that that recovery is possible, then it's not giving in, it's not giving up. It's actually accepting the now and putting that kind of, energy in the recovery box. And I think that was a huge shift for me because I'm not someone who sits back and kicks their legs in the air and kind of says, I'm not going to do, I'm a doer, I'm a pusher, so actually having that kind of realization of it's okay to stop, to surrender, to give up, to stop pushing, because actually that's what I need to do right now. It's that kind of, slowing down to speed up kind of thing. And I would never have done that if I hadn't have started hearing about people who had got better. Because why would you?
Yeah.
I guess,
Wow.
in my mind. So it was, yeah. And I think that's why it's so important to share those sort of recovery stories, isn't it? Because there are people who are right now where I was, and they need to know that, I think, or they need to have that experience, maybe.
And it sounds like what you're offering here and saw in this one person that you heard had recovered was hope. And you mentioned the word hopelessness. And I know
Yeah.
from my own recovery of ME CFS, it can feel really hopeless. And
Yeah.
yeah, it can be really lonely and difficult. And, when you can hear, oh, there are people that have recovered and there is a possibility and you can see some of yourself in them. And, I do see this with certain people that they just want like step 1 to 10. What did you do? I'll follow the same steps and then I'll get better too, right? And it's a little bit more nuanced than that. And,
Yeah.
there are certain like underlying factors I'm sure you are aware of and believe in, like the nervous system and regulation. That is a very key piece. But it's interesting that you say about the acceptance and surrender. And I feel for myself on my journey that until that happened, and it's almost like if you keep pushing, life will literally crack you open.
Yeah.
And it can be really bloody difficult because you are pushing and pushing and pushing, and then life is just like, slow the fuck down and stop. And we get these little whispers, and then it is that drastic sickness, and then we're like, but I could climb mountains and now I can't get out of bed. What? And then when we're in that, we're forced really into
Yeah.
slowing down, stopping, surrendering. And it's interesting you say about the curiosity, the hopelessness to curiosity, because that is such a fundamental part of our nervous system. Because when we are in that hopeless place, we're in that dorsal, that shut down
Yeah.
survival freeze state, and we have to kind of move through the ladder up to that ventral curious. What possibilities are there? But that that's where the nervous system tools can be so helpful.
Yeah.
So when you've been running your podcast then, when you started it, was it literally just you kind of sharing how you were at the time, interviewing people and picking up tips as you went along for your own recovery?
Sort of. I think I can't remember exactly which order they happened in, but I know which order they went out in, but I can't remember exactly what order they were recorded in. But I wanted to share my story. So
Mm-hmm.
me and my partner did an episode together where obviously I did most of the talking, which is what generally happens in our house anyway, if I'm completely honest.
Same.
But so we did that. And then there were a few people that I knew, someone who was a friend that I'd worked with and knew from beforehand. So I asked her if she wanted to be on my podcast. And she said, okay. So we recorded an episode. And then there was someone else that I knew through a long COVID group that I interviewed. And I think they were the first three and they went out. So they were all either me or people I knew. And then I think very quickly it started being, I know this person, you should interview them. So then I got on a doctor who had long COVID, which was like, oh, okay. And then, oh, you should speak to this person. You should speak to that person. So I started getting these kind of, referrals. And, it very quickly kind of spiraled. I think might have been episode 10 was my first international episode. So we went across to North America for episode 10. Well, not physically, obviously, but yeah. And I guess the first few really were kind of sharing stories, sharing experiences. Some people were sharing things that they had found that helped. But, looking back on it, actually, those first few episodes are probably quite triggering for people coming in. because it really is kind of like, this is my experience, maybe validating, but certainly probably quite triggering. But I think, by the time I got into the sort of double digits, it was kind of right, this has got to be what can we do? So it was much more getting that kind of, sharing a story, but also something that's helpful that people can take away. I tried this thing, or, that sort of idea. And as I said, I'm a very sort of, practical, curious, what can I do sort of a person. So that kind of really played into, I thought, well, I'm asking the questions that other people want to know the answers to, because other people are also in that space of not being well that I'm also in. So I think it kind of worked like that. And, I got a bit of confidence, very slowly. You have no confidence in anything, do you, when you're unwell? And I went into this kind of thinking, oh, I can talk to people and I know how to edit, therefore I can do a podcast. Turns out that, like, it's a lot more complex than that, and that being able to talk is not the same as interviewing somebody. In fact, it's kind of completely the opposite. So I learned a lot, let's say. But, it's something that I found immensely satisfying, and that, I learned something from every single guest that I had
I
on.
bet.
Even someone whose story was so drastically different, or who was talking about something that actually wasn't relevant to me because I'd never experienced it, like the taste and smell person. Even though I hadn't actually experienced that as a symptom, I still learned something from her, because, things that were maybe applicable to me in a sort of very roundabout way, or, that sort of thing. And, I started up the wall of Post-its. So someone would say something really profound, and I would write it on a Post-it and I'd stick it on my wall. And I think one of the ones that I quote all the time, I stick it out on my social media like all the time, and I have to remind myself of it even now, because even as a fully recovered person, there are still things you can't do. And it was something like, don't let what you can't do prevent you from doing what you can.
I
And
love that.
I just thought, how amazing is that? Because we will always experience through our lives things that we can't do. Doesn't mean that there aren't things that we can do. And when you're not well, there is so much that you can't do. Like, you can't do life, and yet you can open your curtains and look at the sun, or you can curl up with someone that makes you feel loved, or you can do your breathing exercises, or, whatever that is. There are things that we can do, but, life kind of trains us to focus on the can't, doesn't it?
And I mean, there's a part of our brain, I think it's the reticular activation system, that
Yeah,
is there to prove us right, essentially. And,
exactly.
we are wired to look for danger. So we will err on the side of negativity, which is, why
Exactly.
misery loves company. We can chat about crap all day long, but the good stuff doesn't always come so easy. So,
Yeah,
when we can start to tune that system into confirming we are right, are we confirming that we are in pain and life is awful, or are we confirming that actually there's all these things I can do? And then when,
exactly.
it's like a muscle, we learn to strengthen that, and then we just see things, we see abundance and gratitude and how much we can do everywhere,
Totally.
because we're training that part of us. And yeah, that's a wonderful thing that I have been tuning into and supporting a lot of my clients with as well, is switching that from the negative to the
Mm.
positive, I guess you would say. So
Yeah. And it's amazing when you experience that, isn't it? It's like people will say something to you and be like, oh, you need to do this, you need to do that, you need to look for positive, whatever it is. People will always try and give you advice and tell you what you just need to do. And some of it will resonate and some of it won't. And there are, anyway, let's not go down that rabbit hole. But
yeah, we could go there, talk about that all day.
whatever it is, you do that thing and it works. I've seen this with breathing clients before. You teach them this breathing exercise. You go through this process, and someone comes back the next week or the week after, and they say, "I tried it, and it worked," and you're just like, "Yes." Like, that's amazing, because you have to practice things. You don't
Mm-hmm.
just my former life, I was a musician, so I know this in that context. But with health, you don't think about it in the same way, do you? You never pick up a clarinet and are just able to play it. I don't know why I picked clarinet. It's not my instrument at all. But no one can pick up an instrument and be instantly good at it. You start off making horrible, horrible, horrible noises. And over time, if you practice regularly, you get better and you get better and you get better. And then you start sounding nice and people are like, oh, isn't that lovely? And that is how it goes. And it's the same with other things, isn't it? You don't suddenly start doing a breathing exercise that you've never done before and are good at it. No one is ever good at yoga nidra the first time they try it. Their mind is all over the place. And it's the same with any of these things, isn't it? You have to practice it. And then once you've practiced it, then you start putting it into those situations where you really need it. And then, oh my goodness, okay, I'm getting somewhere. But you have to do all of those steps where you don't feel like you're getting anywhere in order to get to that moment where you kind of do. And I guess that's the frustration, isn't it? You're laying that groundwork, not quite seeing it working until you've built up the foundations. And anyway, analogies are all over the place, but yeah.
I guess it's building that muscle memory as well, because when we are practiced well in something, so something like breathing, and I would love to hear more about this in a sec, those techniques they'll just happen because they're so well practiced, rather than when we are in that dysregulated place and we are struggling. It's so much harder. Our brain is not working as well. We are in that survival limbic system, prefrontal cortex switches off, all of this stuff. It's so much harder to access those tools when we're in that state versus, this is just practice, and it just comes so much more naturally. So thank you for sharing that, because so many people go, oh no, I used that and it didn't work, or I've done this before and it didn't work. Okay, keep going. keep trying.
Going, yeah. Please,
you don't go to
going.
the gym and you're like hench in a day because you went to the gym once. Even though when I do a workout, I'm like, where is my six pack? Because I just worked really fucking hard. No, it doesn't work like that.
It would be so easy if it did.
Oh, I know. Instant gratification.
Oh, yes.
You mentioned breathing in there, and tell us a little bit more about how you see the breath, and is that one of the things that helped your recovery?
Yeah, I think that the breath has this. I was going to say the breath has this special place in my heart, and then realised how that was kind of both a kind of analogy, but it was also kind of physically true as well. But the breath was the first thing that I found that helped. So I spent the first about a year trying all the wrong things, the pushing through, the sort of no denial, all of that sort of stuff. Which guess what didn't work. But I didn't know what else to do, so I kept trying. And then I was introduced to breathwork, and I worked with someone who didn't really understand long COVID, but he taught me enough that made me go, huh, okay. And actually he was an absolutely wonderful human, and probably was kind of the catalyst to recovery, even though some of the things he taught me were not quite long COVID appropriate at the time. Which is kind of why I do what I do now. But back to the breath. The breath is something we take for granted, I think, until we don't, until suddenly it's like, okay, I can't breathe, which was my experience. I had horrendous breathing problems.
Wow.
And I know not everybody does, but for me, it was awful. So realizing that actually there's a wrong way to breathe was a bit of an eye opener. You can breathe right or wrong. I thought it was an absolute, you either breathe or you don't. But it turns out that there are ways to breathe functionally and many more ways to breathe dysfunctionally. So actually starting to bring my breath into this functional way of breathing. And, I will never know because I don't have a time machine, but I don't think my breath was that functional before I got sick, but didn't matter because I was fit, healthy, and everything was fine. And then when I got unwell, obviously that massively exacerbated a pattern that was maybe already a bit dysfunctional into this really extremely problematic kind of breathing pattern, and all of the other stuff that was going on. So it was, yeah, learning how to breathe properly. And, when you have something like long COVID, you can't go at this in the same way that a regular person would, because we can't handle that. We can't go breath holds, big exciting breath work, all of this stuff that, Wim Hof, like let's not even go there. You know, great breath, I think every breath work has a place, but most of them are not long COVID and ME/CFS. It's super, super dental. So coming back to my experience, it was learning to breathe functionally, but doing it gently in a way that wasn't extra triggering while I was doing it. And then learning to use the breath as a down regulating tool. So when I start feeling everything getting going, we're getting into that kind of flight response, there's a breath for that. But when you start getting into that freeze state, or maybe you're in that freeze state, there's a breath for that. It's not the same breath as a fight-flight breath, but there are breath works that you can use to help you in that state, to make you feel that sense of safety. But we got to know our own bodies in order to do that, because the breath work that works for me in that situation is not necessarily going to be the same one that works for you or for anybody else. There are guidelines for sure, but it's quite a personal thing. And one of the things that I think is the most important actually is that breath awareness. And I bang on about this all the time. And a lot of people like using wearables to track their HRV and to track their heart rate. And, I don't want to demonize technology, because it can be useful for some people in some situations. But I also think that we can be too reliant on that. And, it's a tool, not something we want to be reliant on. And the breath is this perfect internal metric that we can tune into, feeling first, always feeling first. And if we are aware of our breath, you can get that data from within. I can know when I wake up, what's my breath doing today? I didn't sleep very well, did I? Feel quite stressed today. Or I'm in that part of my cycle. Okay, yeah, I'm going to be aggressive today. So actually, there's a breath for that as well. Or, whatever it is, you can kind of tune into the breath, use it as that kind of metric, that warning system. I started using it as a, when I was overdoing it, when I was pushing myself a bit too much, I could feel it in my breath before I could feel it anywhere. And I was able to say, okay, I need to stop now. I need to breathe. I need to get into my diaphragm. I need to lie down and shut my eyes. Whatever it was that I could do in that situation. Because I knew that if I didn't, then I was then pushing myself more. And eventually, kaboom, we all know what happens in that situation. So it was that kind of, I don't know about early warning kind of sign, and just using that. Because, it's so hard to know, isn't it? You have some days where maybe you can do a bit more, and then some days where you can't. And how do you know that? Well, you can check it with your breath. If you're feeling that sense of regulation, then you probably can do a little bit more and you'll be okay. Whereas if you're feeling very dysregulated, then it's the opposite. And I found it really, really useful coming out of long COVID at the end. As I was increasing activity, as I was starting to do a bit more and, allowing myself to feel safe doing more things. And the breath was this wonderful, wonderful tool for that, because it told me, can I do more today or can I not? I didn't need an HRV or anything to tell me that started beeping at me. And what happens when something starts beeping at you? Danger. So, your breath doesn't do that to you, but you have to learn that. You have to practice it, and you have to, really, really develop that relationship, I think, with your breath, which I think is a really beautiful thing, because it is within, isn't it? It's it's so tied to our life force. It is our life force.
Yeah, and it's constant.
Yeah, exactly. If you're not breathing, well,
You're dead.
it's exactly. It is absolutely fundamental. The thing that I love, and I hadn't really appreciated this because I guess I took my breath for granted, like most people do, until they don't. Was we talk so much about sleep, and I'm not saying sleep isn't important, because it is. nutrition and hydration, and all of these things are very important. But if we think about it, we can survive without sleep for about 10 days, apparently.
Wow.
Food for several weeks, water for a couple of days, and none of these things are healthy. Don't give up your sleep. But we can only survive without air for a few minutes. So actually, if we think about what should we be prioritizing in our recovery, the breath has got to be up there. So that's huge. It's got such an impact. And the other thing to think about as well is we breathe approximately 25,000 breaths a day, something like that, approximately. It varies person to person, but approximately 25,000 breaths a day. If we are breathing them in a way that is dysfunctional, then with every single breath, every 25,000 breath we breathe, we are ringing those alarm bells in our nervous system. Every breath, ding, ding, ding.
Wow.
Which is very dysregulating to our nervous system. Whereas, and even if we're breathing half our breaths dysfunctionally, that's still quite a lot of danger that we're sensing. Whereas if we are breathing that functional breath, then we are working on this kind of level of regulation. That doesn't mean that we're not going to get triggered by all sorts of things, but that level, we're working from that baseline level of regulation with our breath. Which is absolutely huge, isn't it? When you think about, the nervous system and all these other things in the world that trigger us. And then when we have long COVID or CFS and we get even more triggered by everything because our nervous system is so dysregulated, kind of shows you the power of the breath, doesn't it?
Yeah. And I would love to hear, as I'm sure most people listening now are probably screaming this question at you, what is a functional and a dysfunctional breath pattern? And also, if you recognize that maybe you aren't breathing functionally, what to do with that? Is there any tips or anything you can offer?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question, because that would be my question too. Like, okay, dysfunctional breathing is bad. How do I know? So there's a lot of different ways of breathing dysfunctionally. And basically, dysfunctional breathing is anything that sort of isn't supporting the body. So it's easier to talk about a functional breath because that's a bit more obvious. If that's the right
Yeah,
word.
please go for it.
So a functional breath is through the nose. So that is always step one, breathing through the nose at all times. So what most people will find is that maybe they're sitting, they're at rest, they're lying down, they're probably breathing through their nose. Maybe they're not. But a lot of people will be like, okay, yeah, I'm sitting watching TV, breathing through my nose. Yeah, no problem. I can nose breathe. Everything's fine. But this is where we come into breath awareness. Do you breathe through your nose when you are on your computer? Do you breathe through your nose when you get a little bit stressed? Do you breathe through your nose when you're doing movement, exercise? Do you breathe through your nose when you are talking? That's the one that I slip up on because I get very excited. And do you breathe through your nose when you're sleeping? So all of these different times that you could be maybe not breathing through your nose. So breathing through my nose, step one. Breathing into the diaphragm is step two. So a lot of people don't actually know what the diaphragm is. Diaphragm's a muscle. It's our most important breathing muscle, I would say anyway. It's a big muscle as well. So coming back to long COVID, ME/CFS, I'm going to drop the D word, deconditioning, because we do get deconditioned, don't we, when we don't move? And that includes our diaphragm. So if we're not using our diaphragm gets weaker, it gets smaller, it gets stuck. And there is research backing this up now that people with long COVID do have kind of like tiddly little diaphragms. And the problem with that is that we need to train our diaphragms. We need to start using that muscle and we need to strengthen it up. But what happens when we start to strengthen a muscle too quickly? We get PEMmed, don't we? Too much too soon. So we have to be very careful about when we do this. But yeah, back to the diaphragm, we want to be breathing low into our diaphragm. So actually, this is something that you could all do now. If you put your hand onto your belly, kind of over your belly button, and just notice if you're getting any movement there. And it doesn't need to be a big amount of movement because we're at rest. If we were pumping iron in the gym, then you would be wanting a bit more movement there. But at rest, we don't want a lot of movement, but you do want there to be some movement. So if you're breathing into your diaphragm, that's a great second step. What is very common when we get stressed is that we come into our upper chest. So we breathe into our upper chest, we breathe faster. Often, if we're breathing into our upper chest, we may also start breathing through our mouth. Speeds our breathing up. When our breathing speeds up, ding, 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 hits on our nervous system, danger response. And also in terms of our biochemistry, if we are breathing up here, we're not getting good gas exchange because the good gas exchange happens down the bottom. So diaphragm really, really important. And actually, this is also a really interesting point because when we talk about, those little things that people put on their fingers for the oxygen saturation, I can't breathe and yet my oxygen saturation is at like 99%. And that is because you have the oxygen in your body because you're breathing it in, but it's not getting released because your gas exchange is pants. So comes back to the breathing pattern. It's not that it's not there, it's just not being utilized. So that kind of brings me on to the third part of functional breathing, which is slow. Now, that's kind of different for different people and for different situations. It's not like we need to be at a certain breathing level. A lot of people talk about 6 breaths a minute, which is a really great breath at rest. But I've not met a single person with long COVID or ME/CFS that can do 6 breaths a minute without it making them worse. So, it comes back to practice and progress and it being a process. So, if you start doing 6 breaths a minute when you're breathing 30 breaths a minute, too much too soon. It's great to put it on the later shelf as something to aim for. So it's slowing that breath down from whatever it is to something that's a bit slower. As we slow our breath down, we're getting that better gas exchange. So we're hitting that biochemistry, but we're also calming our nervous system by slowing our breath down. So coming back to the nervous system, if we, our nervous system controls everything, doesn't it? Like literally everything in our body.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
There are very few things that we have direct control over. Really, the only one is the breath. We can control our breath. We can slow our breath down. We can't slow our heart rate down. Well, most people don't. You can't be like, oh, I'll just slow my digestion down. I mean, maybe, or speed it up, or, you can't, maybe you can by using other things, eating the right food or taking drugs or whatever. There are ways to control some of these things, but the breath is the one that we have direct control over. So if we control our breath, we have that direct line into our nervous system, which helps to calm things down, which helps us to feel safer, which helps us to build up that resilience, which helps us to be able to do more and feel better and enjoy our lives more, which is what we all want, isn't it? So the breath is really cool.
And you mentioned earlier about there's a certain breath for up-regulating and a certain breath for down-regulating. And if you're not sure on what we're talking about, I have gone into the details of the nervous system, I think in episode 3. So go back and listen to that if you want more information on what the hell the nervous system is and the different stages and all of that sort of thing. But when we're talking about the up and down, the down regulation, so let's say we're stuck in like a dorsal, that freeze state, and to kind of come back to ventral, we want to go through the sympathetic. So from my perspective, that would be a more active breath. So when we are in maybe that freeze place, how would we up-regulate the breath and how would we down-regulate the breath, and when would we use them?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting, a really interesting question, because I mean, I mentioned Wim Hof earlier in jest, but nothing against Wim Hof. Lots of success with lots of different people. But Wim Hof is a very up-regulating breath. It's putting a huge amount of stress on the body. And that is not appropriate for long COVID and ME/CFS. To be honest, I mean, I trained in Buteyko. That was where I did my training. And even a lot of the Buteyko breath is much too strong. Things like breath holds, I don't think are helpful. they're putting a huge amount of stress on the body and they're triggering us. So, not that they might not be helpful further down the line, but I would say actually not helpful. What I've done for the courses that I teach and when I work with clients is I've actually taken Buteyko and I have taken out all the stressful stuff and I've altered stuff to make it appropriate for people. And, we work from that really low level. And we can then start building things up as and when people can cope with it. But we all, do no harm is rule number one, isn't it? We've got to start from low down and then start building people's tolerance at a rate that works for them. Now, coming back to your question about upregulating and downregulating, to be honest, I would say that in long COVID, there isn't actually really a place for upregulating, because when we're in that freeze state, we want to lean into that freeze in order to allow ourselves to feel that sense of safety in the freeze state. So I would actually say that when we're in the freeze state, that's where we want to be the gentlest with our breathing. So we want those really soft, some people find that humming is too strong for them. Some people find it's good. Even someone who's got a very weak diaphragm may find that diaphragm breathing is too strong for them in that, and actually that just sitting and being with their breath and watching the breath is what they want in that situation. But when we're in that kind of dorsal, that shutdown, that immobilization, that, head literally can't lift my head off the pillow, super, super gentle. And then when we're in that kind of fight flight, it's all about kind of bringing it down. But often when we're in that kind of really, all the alarm bells are ringing, I don't need to mansplain this. People will often say like, oh, you just need to slow your breath down. And like, they're not wrong, but also like, there's no just in that situation. Your body is screaming at you. Your body thinks you're in mortal danger. Just slow your breath down. I'm sorry, what? We need those kind of tools. What do we do in that situation? And we've got a couple of kind of what we call emergency exercises that we use in that situation that kind of, they do slow our breath down, but they're kind of like biohacks to do it, which is really cool. And then, when we're in that place of regulation, in that, the holy grail, the green zone, our ventral yay zone, that's where we, it's maintenance when we're there, isn't it? We're here, we're finally here. Isn't this wonderful? Okay, how do we stay here? And I think, what's so wonderful about the nervous system is that as we start to be more regulated, to build that resilience, maybe that is where we're able to start adding those little stressors, because we talk about stress up to stress down, don't we? And like, great. But I always say to people, don't stress up until you're comfortable with stressing down. In long COVID and ME/CFS, we are stressed up, or we're so stressed up that we're off the other end. We're off the cliff and we're in that dorsal, aren't we? So when you are unable to deal with any sort of stress, for goodness sake, don't be adding any more on. But once you've done some of that more gentle work, you are feeling a bit more resilient. That is maybe where some of these kind of gentle breath holds, very gentle, or some of these other things maybe do have their place, but use with care. That was the kind of place where I started doing the cold water swimming, which is a stressor on the body. But I was able to handle that by that point, and I think the sort of slightly stronger breathworks have that similar sort of impact. It is that stressor, but it's not the same as cold water, but you get that kind of, but then you come back down again, and you have to know how to come back down again. Otherwise, you're just kind of going off into the stratosphere, aren't you? And again, we all know what that feels like. So, it's sort of understanding our own nervous systems, isn't it? I think, that's kind of what this is all about, isn't it? And we've talked so much about the nervous system as well. And I never understood we even have a nervous system. If someone had said nervous system to me, like, when I got ill, I was like, I don't know what that
What's that
is.
got to do with anything? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, it was, one of the things that helped me the most was really understanding
Mm.
that I had a nervous system, what
Mm.
it did, these different states, how they looked for me. And then I could start to kind of put some of these techniques that I'd started to learn into that kind of, what works for me in different places.
Mm.
When I'm in shutdown, what do I need? Again, it comes back to what does my body need, doesn't it? In every moment, it's what does my body need? And I still
Mm.
do that now. We talk so much about recovery. What did you do to recover? And I think, that's so
Changed my
important to
life
share.
and lifestyle.
Exactly. But actually, the things that I learned along the way and the things that helped me to recover are things that I've taken forward in my life now.
Mm.
So, yes, I pushed myself hard. I was up the mountains at the weekend and I was really going for it and it was amazing. But also, there were times over the Christmas period where I had days where I didn't do stuff, and it's that balance. I think balance is my word. Maybe it needs to be my
Mm.
2025 word.
Maybe.
It's that, yes, we push ourselves, and yes, and isn't that so great when we get the adrenaline pumping and the blood pumping? And it feels wonderful to have that back in my life because it was something that I missed. But also that I have appreciation for lying down and doing my breath work every morning and
Mm.
sitting on a beach and watching the waves and staring at the blue sky. I live in Scotland and we have blue sky today. Like, this is a big deal. And I am so much more appreciative of that than I would have been before, particularly on a work day where I don't really get to go and
Mhm.
enjoy it. So I think, yeah, like you just said, there's so there's so much of the me from before that I still have. I'm still fundamentally me, but I'm a much more balanced, better living, better lifestyle. My partner says I've turned into a hippie, um, but it's that, it's respect for your body, isn't it? You're not indestructible. And
Mm.
if you treat yourself like you are, then eventually the body's going to say no. And it's not going to say no at a time that's convenient to you. It's
Mm.
going to say no in a really uncomfortable way at a time that doesn't work, but you're going to have no option but to listen to it. And I think that's probably one of the greatest lessons that I've learned is that,
Mm.
if you don't have that balance in your life, then, the scales will tip and tip and tip until
Yeah, you're
kaboom.
forced to stop. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
exactly.
And thank you so much for everything you have shared and so much of the breath that you've been talking about. I mean, it's fascinating and I would love to hear more about it. I'm also hearing there's a theme in here on how much we push and when is
Yeah,
stress appropriate and when is stress not appropriate. And, for example, the
totally.
cold water swimming, like I've been having a cold shower every day for the last 6 months. And despite having recovered from ME/CFS, I would still say my immune system is sensitive. It's not weak, but it can be sensitive.
Mm.
And, we're recording this the first week of January. I swear every single person I have spent time with over the Christmas period has a cough or a cold. And
Oh,
I have not caught anything. I came back from Canada and America less than a month ago, and normally traveling will give me a cold, and I've not caught anything. And I honestly think that is down to that small amount of stress I can handle that's helped improve my immune system. So, there
mm.
is, it can be helpful to add stress, but not, as you say, when our stress bucket is already too full. It's
Yeah.
balance. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing everything you have. And if people are curious to hear more about you, what you offer, where can they find you? How can they work with you?
Yeah. So I'm really imaginative, as I said, the podcast is longcovidpodcast.com. And the breathing stuff, I work one-to-one with people. I also run long COVID breathing with my business partner, Vicky, who I met through the podcast. And we run group courses, which people love because of the community feel and the validation and also the, all of that and learning to breathe because breathing is awesome. So you can find that through longcovidbreathing.com. And I spent yesterday revamping our website and I'm really, really proud of it.
Well done. Amazing. And we'll put all the links in the show notes as well.
Thank you.
Another little question actually. The breathing support that you offer, is that only for people who have long COVID, or could that also be appropriate for anyone that recognising is that maybe their nervous system is a little bit overly sensitive or dysregulated, or maybe they have something like ME/CFS and they need that slight the gentleness that I'm hearing is what you offer.
Yeah, I work with all sorts of different people. The courses that we run are kind of designed for long COVID and ME/CFS. The website's long COVID breathing because it's a bit catchier than long COVID and ME/CFS and this and that breathing.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, we are long COVID, breathing for long COVID and ME/CFS. But yeah, I would work with anybody who, dysregulated nervous system. We talk a lot about burnout and the kind of correlations there as well. And I've spoken to a couple of people who have had both long COVID and burnout separately. And it's amazing, they're not the same thing, but it's amazing how similar a lot of the things are, or how many people have long COVID who are on the verge of burnout and all of these things. So yeah, absolutely. I love working with anybody.
Amazing. Well, yeah, thank you so much, and we'll put everything in the show notes below. And thank you for coming on and sharing your wisdom. Thank you for listening to this episode of Calm Your Nervous System. I hope you found the conversation as interesting as I did. If you would like to start healing your nervous system, I have a free energy diary available just for podcast listeners, which will really help you see your blind spots about how you're spending your time and your energy. Find it at jennyadamscoach.co.uk/podcast. Find out more about me and somatic coaching in the show notes below. See you next time.